What happens when you stop justifying yourself? Not in a petty, passive-aggressive way, not in silence used as a weapon, but truly stop, completely, without expectation of being understood or forgiven or admired. What changes when your inner compass becomes sovereign, when your life ceases to be an explanation and instead becomes a demonstration? At first, nothing. The world doesn't notice. You're still moving through the same rooms, working the same job, nodding at the same people. But underneath, there is a shift. Small, almost imperceptible, like a boat that's adjusted its rudder by only a few degrees. Yet with time, that shift will take you across an entirely different ocean. Justification is the language of insecurity. Not always intentionally, but instinctively. It's the reflex to reach outward for affirmation, to dress your choices in the costume of acceptability, to explain away your differences, to soften your truth, to disguise your sovereignty under layers of social lubrication. And, for most people, it begins so early they never even realize they're doing it. They just grow accustomed to a life lived under scrutiny, real or imagined, and they respond with rehearsed modesty, carefully packaged backstories, and disarming smiles. But there comes a moment in every thinking person's life, a moment of deep inner exhaustion, when they begin to suspect that this endless cycle of explanation is not an act of connection, but a form of betrayal. That every time they plead for someone to understand their motives, they lose something. That every sentence beginning with, "What I meant was," slowly chips away at their integrity. And so the Stoic begins his departure. He withdraws not from others, but from the need to persuade. He ceases the game of interpretation. He allows his actions to stand on their own merit, without commentary, without apology. If questioned, he may respond, but never with the desperation of someone trying to protect an identity. He speaks like a man who has nothing to lose but his principles. He listens like a man who has already decided that dignity outweighs acceptance. To most people, this posture seems cold, but that is only because they've never experienced peace without external approval. They mistake intensity for harshness, silence for detachment. But the Stoic knows the truth. There is nothing more loving than a person who refuses to lie, especially about themselves. Justification is often confused with honesty, but it is, in fact, the opposite. It is the performance of honesty, the desire to be perceived as right, noble, fair, generous. But when you strip away the desire to be seen a certain way, what remains is raw truth, unpolished, direct, and deeply uncomfortable for many. But that discomfort is where transformation begins. You begin to see that most arguments are not about facts, but about optics. Most social conflicts are not about the content of what was said or done, but the way it was received, filtered, and remembered. When you stop justifying, you step outside of that system entirely. You no longer accept the role of defendant in trials you did not agree to. You no longer prepare defenses for imagined attacks. You reclaim all the energy that was once spent composing explanations in the darkness of sleepless nights. This is where the first insight emerges, quietly but unmistakably. Insight 1. You reclaim your life from the court of public opinion. It is not that you stop caring what others think. That's impossible. We are social creatures. The judgment of others will always register. But it no longer governs. It no longer holds the keys to your behavior. You see it, you hear it, and then you keep walking. When Marcus Aurelius said, "It never ceases to amaze me," we all love ourselves more than other people, but care more about their opinion than our own, He wasn't issuing a condemnation. He was diagnosing a disease of the soul, a disease that leaves men stranded in the audience of their own lives, waiting for permission to act, for validation to speak, for understanding to exist. The Stoic rejects this illness, not by becoming arrogant or aloof, but by training his mind to value the opinion of one person above all, his own when sharpened by reason and committed to virtue. And this isn't easy. In the beginning, it feels like loss. You'll find yourself misunderstood by people you love. You'll say something honest and watch it get twisted. You'll act from integrity and be accused of coldness or selfishness. You'll lose friendships that were built on your willingness to play the explain yourself game. You'll feel alone. But that loneliness is sacred. It is the space where your character is forged. In the absence of applause, you must decide what truly matters. In the silence left by those who disapprove, you must determine whether you're. And when you find that they are, when you realize you can keep your head high without a chorus of validation, you will have reached a threshold few ever cross. There is a kind of quiet that only comes to those who no longer explain. Not because they are hiding, but because they have already spoken in the only language that matters: consistent action. Their lives become legible not in words, but in pattern. You can read them by watching them. How they treat strangers, how they navigate failure, how they handle power, how they respond to betrayal. These are their statements. These are their justifications, if any remain. And in this new state of being, there is no need to over-communicate. You find yourself speaking less, not from fear, but from precision. You realize how much of speech is wasted on defense. You become economical with your words, not secretive, but deliberate. You speak with the awareness that not everything must be said, and that many things must never be explained. This is not the absence of communication. It is the arrival of something higher: clarity. A clarity that no longer needs an audience to confirm its truth. The man who walks this path begins to emit a strange kind of energy. People feel it. They may not like it. Some will call it arrogance. Some will call it distance. But a few, those who are seeking their own freedom, will recognize it for what it is: authority, not over others, but over oneself. A man who no longer chases validation is the most dangerous kind of man, because he is free, and it all begins the moment he stops justifying who he is. When you stop justifying yourself, you do not simply adopt a new behavior. You trigger a profound restructuring of your internal architecture. What once felt like a social skill, the ability to explain, to rationalize, to soften the blow of your decisions, suddenly reveals itself as a form of dependence. You come to see how much of your life was not lived for its own sake, but as a kind of argument. Not a conscious debate, but an ongoing subconscious appeal to others. Understand me, approve of me, forgive me. It is a quiet addiction, and like any addiction, it rewards you just enough to keep you from quitting. A kind word here, a nod of understanding there, and "I get it now" that feels like peace. But it isn't peace, it's permission. And when your peace depends on permission, you are not living freely. You are negotiating your existence one conversation at a time. The Stoics knew this long before psychology caught up. They understood that the desire to explain oneself too often arises from the ego's fear of being misunderstood. But that fear, once examined, always collapses into something smaller, something weaker than it pretends to be. For what is the worst that can happen if someone misunderstands you? They think less of you? They misrepresent your character? they walk away, so be it. Better to be misjudged with honor than to be liked through self-betrayal. And this brings us to the next realization, one that doesn't arrive all at once, but like dawn creeping across the walls of a long-shadowed room. Insight 2. You begin to act from your highest self, not from your fears. Justification, at its core, is fear management. You are afraid that your actions will be seen through the wrong lens. You are afraid that your silence will be taken as guilt, that your conviction will be mistaken for cruelty, that your difference will be interpreted as defect. So you explain and explain and explain. But once you stop, something radical happens. Your actions become cleaner. Why? Because they are no longer filtered through the imagined gaze of others. You are no longer trying to act in a way that will require the fewest explanations later. You act from principle, not anticipation. From clarity, not apology. And in this shift, your decisions become simpler. Not easier, but simpler. You find that much of the moral fog that once surrounded your choices was not the complexity of the decision itself, but the imaginary conversation you feared it would spark. When that imagined dialogue dies, the decision shines through. Should you say no to the favor that violates your boundary? Yes. No justification required. Should you walk away from a relationship where your soul is shrinking? Yes. No lengthy post-mortem necessary. Should you pursue a passion that others will not understand? Yes. Let the misunderstanding be theirs to hold. And here, you start to taste the edges of true autonomy. Not the rebellious, I don't care what anyone thinks kind that teenagers shout while still craving attention, but the sober, sacred kind that says, I care, but I am not controlled. This is the difference. The Stoic is not immune to emotion. He is not above connection, but he refuses to be ruled by either. He acts as conscience dictates, not as reputation demands. And that difference between inner compass and outer audience is what makes his life coherent. You begin to recognize the power of restraint. Not only the restraint to withhold anger or indulgence, but the restraint to withhold explanation. To let people sit with your truth and choose how they will digest it, or not. You stop managing other people's emotional digestion. You stop editing your decisions like public statements. You stop putting quotation marks around your life. And in doing so, you begin to live it. This internal shift is often invisible at first, but over time, others feel it. They notice that you no longer flinch when confronted, that you no longer over-explain small details, that you don't collapse into long monologues when accused, that you answer with calm or with silence, and that both carry the weight of a man who has already made peace with his judgment. They might push back. People who have grown accustomed to your justifications will feel discomfort in your new posture. They'll interpret your restraint as pride. They'll accuse you of emotional withholding. They'll ask, why won't you just say something? And in that moment, you'll see it clearly. They don't want understanding. They want control. That's the moment you'll understand the full cost of your past explanations. They weren't conversations. They were contracts. Every time you explained yourself out of fear, you signed away a part of your authority. You trained others to expect your defense as their right. And now, in your silence, you are tearing up the contract. Not with anger, not with vengeance, but with stillness. This is not the path of least resistance. It is the path of least distortion. And it leads to a more honest life. One where your yes means yes, and your no means no, and your presence no longer requires a preface. Here, you begin to move differently. You don't explain your productivity. You work. You don't explain your solitude. You enjoy it. You don't explain your healing. You pursue it. You don't explain your values. You live them. And the irony, of course, is that the less you explain yourself, the more understandable you become. Not in the artificial clarity of wordiness, but in the unmistakable language of consistency. People may not agree with you, but they will recognize your sincerity. And over time, they will trust you. Not because you're always agreeable, but because you are always real. This is what happens when you stop justifying yourself. You become visible, not through argument, but through essence. You become understood, not through persuasion, but through integrity. You become loved, not for who others think you are, but for who you have actually become. And if that love is scarce, so be it. You no longer beg for it, because you have tasted something better. The quiet dignity of needing nothing more than the approval of your own soul. Once you begin to act without justification, when your thoughts, choices, and boundaries arise cleanly from within, and not as rehearsed defenses, you start to sense a monumental shift in the structure of your relationships. Not just with others, but with yourself. You stop relating to life as a series of social calculations, and start relating to it as a lived expression of principle. And in that shift, many things fall away. False alliances dissolve. Performative intimacy evaporates. Conversations lose their nervous ornamentation. But what remains, what stubbornly persists through this quiet upheaval, is real. And real is rare. Because justification is not only a way we protect ourselves, it's a way we negotiate with others. It's how we try to keep relationships intact while not being fully ourselves. How we bend truth into shapes we think others can accept. It's the compromise we offer when we believe our authenticity might cost us love. And so we hide, not with lies, but with explanations. We justify our silence, our time, our preferences, our grief, our growth. We walk around with disclaimers stapled to our backs, hoping they soften the edges of our becoming. But when you remove them, when you stop explaining and start existing, you discover that not everyone can handle the unedited version of you. And that's when the third insight begins to crystallize. Insight 3. You expose and dissolve inauthentic connections. It's not that people are malicious, but many relationships are built not on truth, but on compromise. Not on acceptance, but on performance. We play roles. We adjust tone. We shrink opinions. We pretend to agree. We keep the peace, not because we are peaceful, but because we are afraid of rupture. And justification is the glue that holds this illusion together. You are allowed to be different as long as you explain it. You can have needs as long as you apologize for them. You can say no as long as you soften it with 3 reasons and a nervous laugh. But if you remove the justification, if you just are, some people will panic. They don't know how to relate to a version of you that doesn't bend. They might say you've changed, that you're distant, that you've grown cold. But what they're really feeling is the loss of leverage, the removal of access to the control panel they once thought they understood. And yes, that hurts. The man who stops justifying himself doesn't walk into liberation with a smirk. He walks in with solitude. He feels the sting of friendships that cannot hold the truth. He notices who drifts away when the performance ends. He grieves the connections that collapse under the weight of his integrity. But he does not go back. He does not shrink to keep others comfortable. Now, some exciting news. Our channel now offers a members club. By joining it, you'll unlock exclusive benefits, deeper content dives, and personal insights. Join us on this journey, and let's build a meaningful life together. And I also humbly ask you to leave a comment, as it helps my channel immensely. If you do not know what to comment, just write "better every day," so I know you reached this far. And don't forget to subscribe for more content like this. Also, I've linked some books on Stoicism that helped me become the man I am today, and will also help you achieve a Stoic mindset, because the clarity is worth the cost. For the first time, he sees who stands with him not for convenience, but for character. He sees who respects him not because he is agreeable, but because he is anchored. He sees who listens not to answer, but to understand. And in this new landscape, new relationships begin to emerge. Relationships built on resonance, not appeasement. People drawn not to his performance, but to his presence. Conversations that do not circle around polite deception, but that go straight to the marrow. He speaks less, but says more. He explains less, but means more. It is a strange paradox. The less you explain yourself, the more clearly you are seen. Not by everyone, but by the right ones. And they come not in crowds, but in handfuls. Not loudly, but unmistakably. They find you in your stillness, because they are moving toward the same center. This is the hidden reward of walking without justification. It clears the field. It leaves behind only what can stand in truth. And in that barren, beautiful field, something unshakable grows. But let us not pretend it is easy, because one of the deepest instincts we possess is to preserve harmony. And justification often masquerades as peacekeeping. We explain to avoid offense. We soften to maintain connection. We stretch to keep things intact. And sometimes, for a moment, it works. But the cost is always the same: self-respect. When you no longer pay that price, people will notice. They will challenge you. They will test the new boundaries. They will press for the version of you they remember. And when you do not return it, some will walk away. But in their absence, your self-trust will grow. Because every time you choose not to justify yourself, you signal to your mind, "My truth is enough. My integrity is valid. My path does not require applause." And your nervous system will start to believe you. The anxiety that once accompanied difference will fade. The panic that followed disapproval will lessen. You will breathe more easily, speak more slowly, listen more fully. And with this, your presence begins to mature into something rare. Not just calm, but grounded. Not just still, but anchoring. People will start to feel it in your silence, in the way you don't rush to fill the air, in the way you meet conflict without flinch or fury, in the way you live as if you've already made peace with your choices and no longer need the world's permission to live them out. You will not be loud, but you will be unmistakable, and some will try to draw you back. They'll tell you you've become difficult, that you're not as open as you used to be, that you've lost your warmth. But you know the truth. You've stopped managing their emotions with your transparency. You've stopped padding every truth with sugar. You've stopped being soft just to be safe. Because you've learned that kindness without clarity is cowardice. That peace without truth is pretense. And that explanation, when offered as a defense of your right to be whole, is not communication. It is negotiation. And you no longer negotiate your worth. In this space, the fear of being misunderstood begins to rot at the root. Not because you don't care, but because you have come to see that understanding is a gift, not an obligation. that those who are meant to walk with you will not require a map to your soul. They will feel its pulse in how you live. And the rest, let them talk. Let them question. Let them invent stories in your absence. You are not absent from yourself, and that is the only presence that truly matters. There is a moment, not loud, not cinematic, when you realize the weight you've always carried was not truth, but the performance surrounding it. You were not exhausted because life was hard. You were exhausted because you were explaining your existence at every step. To friends, to family, to strangers. The subtle defense behind every smile. The calculated tone in every no. The extra words. The softened pauses. All of it, designed to protect the fragile contract. If I explain myself enough, maybe you'll accept me. But when that contract is burned, when you stand naked before the judgment of others and refuse to flinch, you are no longer a person seeking safety. You are a person who has chosen reality over comfort. And you understand for the first time how rare this is. Because most people don't want reality. They want reassurance. They want a proof that their own fear-based behavior is justified. And your refusal to explain unnerves them because it exposes the hollowness of that illusion. And so, we arrive at one of the most paradoxical outcomes of no longer justifying yourself. Insight 4. You begin to live in quiet rebellion against a world addicted to performance. The modern world thrives on curated selves. We are taught from childhood to present the most acceptable version of ourselves at all times. Schools grade us not only on work, but on compliance. Jobs reward us not only for results, but for deference. Relationships are too often maintained not by honesty, but by strategic omissions. And social media has become a theater where even the most personal pain must come wrapped in explanatory captions. To stop justifying yourself in this environment is not merely a personal decision, it is an act of resistance. You are stepping outside the play, refusing your role, tearing off the costume. This will not go unnoticed. The world, confused by your stillness, will assign you labels. Difficult, cold, uncooperative, mysterious, condescending. And you will feel the old itch rise, the temptation to explain, to correct the record, to show them you're still good. But now you will catch yourself. You will pause. You will smile, maybe sadly, maybe knowingly, and you will walk on, because you no longer need to defend your goodness. You need only to live it, and that changes your pace. You no longer rush into arguments to be understood. You don't inject clarifying statements into every conversation. You don't volunteer disclaimers about your choices. You start moving with the grace of someone who has nothing left to prove. And something incredible begins to happen. You start to trust yourself again, not as an idea, but as a lived, felt reality. You begin to notice that the voice inside your head, the one that was always bracing for judgment, is growing quieter. It still speaks sometimes, but you don't follow it anymore. You listen, you nod, and you return to your center. This is the return home, not to comfort, but to coherence, to integrity, to the unshakable inner posture that says, "This is who I am." Not because I've justified it to anyone, but because I've examined it, chosen it, and committed to it. And from that place, your relationship with the past begins to shift. Most people carry their past like a courtroom transcript, always ready to explain why they did what they did, always prepared to reopen the trial and argue for a more favorable verdict. But the Stoic understands, the past is not a performance, it is a foundation. If you have learned, if you have grown, if you have reconciled with your own conscience, then no justification is necessary. not for the mistakes, not for the detours, not even for the pain you caused while still becoming. You do not erase it, you do not deny it, but you do not remain chained to it either. This is where the work deepens. Because stopping justification doesn't only mean refusing to explain yourself to others. It means refusing to keep explaining your past to yourself in a way that stunts your growth. It means allowing the story to rest. It means accepting that you acted then with the awareness you had, and now you act differently. No disclaimers, no footnotes, just evolution. And that evolution becomes visible in how you carry yourself. You no longer seek out old wounds just to re-explain them to new people. You no longer apologize for the parts of you that were forged in fire. You no longer need others to see your scars as beautiful. You know they are, and that knowing is enough. And in this quiet confidence, your focus shifts entirely. You stop asking, "Do they understand me?" You start asking, "Am I being honest?" You stop asking, "Do they agree with me?" You start asking, "Am I acting in alignment?" You stop asking, "How will this be received?" You start asking, "Is this in accordance with reason, virtue, and my true nature?" And these questions are not asked aloud. They live in your breath, in your posture, in your daily rituals. You begin to build a life not just free from justification, but immune to it. The kind of life that does not need to shout its meaning into the world, because it quietly radiates from everything you touch. You begin to shape your environment accordingly. You notice how often certain spaces require you to perform, and you leave them. You see which friendships were built on your explainability, and you release them. You remember how often you kept yourself small to be understood, and you grow anyway. And the fear that once filled that growth with anxiety, it shrinks. Not because you've killed it, but because you've stopped feeding it the fuel of justification. It has nothing left to feed on, and in its place, clarity grows. The clarity of a man who moves through the world not with answers, but with presence. Not with speeches, but with consistency. Not with apologies, but with authenticity. There is a silence that arrives only after the storm of explanation has passed. Not the awkward silence of unresolved tension, but the deep, resonant quiet that follows a man who has nothing left to prove. This silence is not an absence of words. It is the presence of alignment, of integrity, of authority. It does not shout, but it is heard. It does not convince, but it compels. It is the signature of someone who has stopped arguing with the world, and instead become rooted in his reasoned nature. And here, finally, we uncover the fifth and most transformative insight. Insight 5. You transcend ego and become governed by truth. To stop justifying yourself is to unseat the ego from the throne of your inner court. The ego thrives on defense. Its fuel is explanation. Its armor is narrative. It cannot bear to be misjudged, misread, misquoted. And so it wraps every action in layers of context, every choice in stories, every truth in disclaimers. But once you begin to live from a deeper source, once you reorient your identity around virtue rather than perception, the ego's demands begin to seem not only exhausting, but absurd. You no longer feel the need to control how others see you, because you've accepted that their perception says more about them than about you. You've seen that explanation often conceals insecurity, and you would rather be misunderstood in strength than understood in weakness. You would rather speak with your life than with your mouth. You would rather live in truth than perform in fear. This does not mean you become stubborn or unyielding. In fact, the opposite. When the need for justification dies, humility can finally breathe. You no longer defend your flaws. You tend to them. You no longer posture around your ignorance. You study. You no longer argue over your limitations. You accept them and transcend them through discipline. A man who is free of justification becomes precise. His life gains a cutting edge. He no longer meanders through social rituals built to conceal discomfort. He no longer participates in performances designed to win approval. His time becomes sacred, his words rare, his yes deliberate, his no complete. And this discipline creates presence, the kind of presence that doesn't need to be introduced. It walks into the room before he does. It shapes silence into meaning. It slows the heartbeat of conflict. It invites truth, not through argument, but through example. It is not that he is never challenged. He is. But he no longer reacts as a man under siege. He evaluates. He considers. And, if correction is needed, he accepts it with calm. Not because he has anything to prove, but because truth, not ego, is his master. And when he is right, when he is misunderstood or maligned, he does not scramble to be cleared. He lets the world speak and outlasts its noise. For what can outlast a man aligned with truth? Time always reveals what explanation tries to rush. And when a man builds his life on truth, he can afford to wait. He does not compete in the arena of perception. He stands at its edge, quietly living what others debate. And those who see him, truly see him, will come closer. They will sit beside his fire not because it is loud, but because it is warm. And in that warmth, they too will begin to put down their armor. They will feel, perhaps for the first time, what it means to simply be, without performance, without justification, without fear. In this way, the man who stops justifying himself does more than free himself. He becomes a beacon for others, a lighthouse in a storm of posturing. He reminds others that it is possible to be whole without being explained, to be noble without applause, to be silent without surrender. But this life is not for the faint of heart. It requires the willingness to be alone, the willingness to be misunderstood, the willingness to be called names, to be judged unfairly, to walk away from praise when it's laced with expectation. It requires the death of the people-pleaser, the mask-maker, the ego-fed performer. It requires that you step into the stillness of your own conscience and build your home there, even when the rest of the world calls it exile. But it is not exile. It is return. It is return to the place where your worth was never dependent on explanation, where your actions needed no audience, where your decisions were shaped not by strategy, but by soul. And once you've lived there, once you've tasted that clean air, you can never go back. You will still speak. You will still explain when it is useful and sincere. But you will no longer explain in order to survive. You will no longer speak in order to belong. You will no longer argue for your place at the table. You will bring your chair, your voice, your silence, and you will sit, fully intact, because you no longer seek a permission to be who you are. You have already granted it, and in that quiet, steady certainty, your life begins, not as a justification, but as a truth. Now, if any part of this message has been helpful to you, leave us your like and comment, helping the algorithm recommend it to someone who needs it at this time. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss new videos. And if you look through the videos we've already uploaded, you're sure to find something to take with you. Have a good day.